My name is David Hart, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the nerve center of the Sustainability Solutions Initiative. I'm going to just say a little bit about this speaker, but going to let Paul Anderson say a little bit more. And I want to do that by kind of framing why we're so excited to have Kohl Kanwit here today. So the Sustainability Solutions Initiative has been going for a while, and it's this idea of getting interdisciplinary teams together and working in stakeholder partnerships to tackle problems here in Maine and around the planet, especially starting in Maine. So this will be a good example of that. Growing out of that, we started to realize there were other important problems that we didn't tackle when we first wrote the first part of our SSI grant, but that we had opportunities to expand that. And one direction we wanted to go was to focus more on coastal issues where there's obviously urgent kind of needs for science to link to decision making. And I'm happy to say that I got to work with Kathleen Bell and Laura Lindenfeld as co-PIs on a $6 million grant that was funded by the National Science Foundation that connects 4 institutions in Maine. I think Chris Peterson's here somewhere from College of the Atlantic, and also 4 institutions down in New Hampshire, particularly folks at UNH, including Kevin Gardner and a number of colleagues. So we call this thing NEST. If you hear a new acronym, we're throwing it around. It's closely related to SSI. It stands for the New England Sustainability Consortium, and this particular project is kind of one piece of expanding work we hope to do to tackle new problems and work in new partnerships, all in this solutions-focused way. So this particular project, I think, is a perfect example of the tight social networks we have in Maine that we were able to, once we got even a glimmer of the idea for the project, the first thing that I did together with John Peckinham was to go see Paul Anderson, who instantly connected us to both the shellfish side of this coastal pollution problem and also the beach side. Kohl Kanwit for the shellfish and DMR perspectives, and Kerr Kaiser for the Maine Healthy Beaches program. Our colleagues in New Hampshire did the same thing, and we kind of figured out some of the beginnings of what it would take to do useful work on this. And so the first time I talked to Kohl, I was just delighted with how much she knew, how much she wanted to collaborate, and the fact that we can do that here in Maine in these ways, I think, is a really amazing resource, and I'm very grateful for this. I'm going to let Paul, who knows a lot, has known Kohl much longer than I have, do a little bit more of the introduction, but even Paul's role in leading Maine Sea Grant just shows how lucky we are to have these great resources and great colleagues. So,
thanks, Dave. Good afternoon. I don't have a whole lot more to say, but I have known Kohl for quite a long time, and it's been a pleasure to know her. I think we met when I was with DMR at the time, and you got to know my wife, and we were working at the Farnsworth Museum on a temporary gig. Oh, wow. But Kohl went to McGill University, got her degree there, and very soon got a job at DMR. And for the last, I think, 10 years or so, have been primarily doing stuff with various fisheries. And she climbed the ladder there very quickly because the folks there wisely saw both her skills as a scientist, but also in being able to manage people and manage information. So, so now she directs the Bureau of Public Health, under which all of the shellfish sanitation stuff fits. And I was once the director of Bureau of Public Health. And when I started that job, I had hair. And so I'm still curious why Kohl still has hair. Might be just a nuance, I'm not sure. But thanks for coming up and talking to us. We look forward to hearing your talk. Kohl Kanwit.
Okay, so find my little thing here. Thank you for the nice, warm introductions. I have to start this presentation with this slide here. So I just have to provide everybody with a warning. If somebody ever asks you for a bio, if you're going to give a talk, ask if you need a picture. This picture was from about when Paul met me. I was probably 19 years old or something. And I got a serious razzing at work about this picture. So just fair warning, the dangers of Google images. But I am going to talk seriously about basically human impacts, clean water, and how that relates to shellfish sanitation and what we do at the Department of Marine Resources. And because of the audience here today, I really focused a lot on water quality issues. I touched a little bit on biotoxin. We have 4 major components to our bureau. There's the Growing Area Program, which has water quality and biotoxin in that portion. And then there's also a shellfish management component because Maine allows municipal shellfish management. So towns are allowed to regulate their resource harvest for shellfish. So we have people who liaison with the towns. And then we also have a dealer certification program. And if we have time, I'll show you a little bit on that and how that relates to public health as well. So the importance of clean water. As you all probably know, bivalve shellfish are filter feeders, and they pose a unique risk to consumers because they're potential vectors for illness. A lot of people say, especially with soft shell clams, well, you know, they're cooked, so why is this a problem? Well, if you actually cooked shellfish to the temperature you'd have to kill everything in them, they would be inedible. So they're considered raw, like oysters, you just eat raw, or lightly cooked, and that's why they pose a threat, even partially cooked shellfish. So they can transmit things like bacteria, viruses, vibrios, and biotoxin. And so theoretically, clean water should mean clean bivalve shellfish, and that's basically the premise of the program. So the cause for concern with public health and the consumption of bivalve shellfish is in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Public health officials started noticing that there was a connection between illness outbreaks and the consumption of raw bivalve shellfish. In 1924, there was a widespread typhoid fever outbreak, and the Surgeon General developed the first control measures for to ensure shellfish safety. So one of the big issues was trying to keep programs consistent, because if you harvest in Maine, the shellfish should be as safe as what you harvest in Florida. And so it was trying to make sure that as shellfish are traveling across borders, that there was a consistency in product and people weren't going to get sick. It's pretty interesting, you know, if you ever have time and are interested, the story of the 1924 typhoid outbreak is pretty interesting because it was one of the first times that they used radio and newspaper to communicate about outbreaks. And it was really the first national outbreak that caused it was the first illness outbreak that caused a national stir, really. So it's kind of an interesting little story there. So what is clean water in regard to bivalve shellfish sanitation? Because clean water sort of means different things for different people. What we're looking for is that we want to see evidence that it's not contaminated by fecal material. So another thing we hear a lot is, well, some communities have even done ribotyping of water, and they've shown that it's from seagulls. Well, you know, poop is poop, and we don't eat poop. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's not a good thing to be eating. So, you know, we do address that a lot. It's not just human poop that we're interested in. And that's why fecal coliform is, you know, theoretically a good indicator, because any warm-bodied animal has that in their feces. So we also want to show that there's evidence that marine biotoxins are not present, so biotoxins that cause issues for human health. And also that it's not contaminated by this sweeping term, other deleterious substances. So that means things like heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, you know, it encompasses a lot. And that's a very difficult part of the program because there's little guidance, surprisingly, on some of levels that are safe or not safe for things in shellfish consumption. So the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, this is what we operate under. It's a state and federal cooperative program that's recognized by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference. So I'll explain a little bit about what this is. We don't do this alone. You know, Maine has authority over our shellfish resources, but we have to do, if we want to export what we harvest, we have to be able to comply with the National Shellfish Sanitation Model Ordinance so that they can ensure that the shellfish from Maine are safe. So this is the guideline that we go with, and the purpose of it is for the sanitary control of shellfish, like I said, for human consumption, and to promote and improve the sanitation of bivalve shellfish. So this includes clams, oysters, mussels, and scallops. However, if it's just the adductor mussel from scallops, it's exempt from the model ordinance because they don't have biotoxin or bacterial issues. To also standardize the sanitation for interstate commerce. So, you know, as I said before, this shellfish from Maine should be as safe as the shellfish from Florida, even though they have different challenges, you know, different biotoxins and different issues. So the NSSP members include the shellfish authorities. So in Maine, the only authority is the Department of Marine Resources. So we establish classifications and regulations and whatnot for bivalve shellfish. But other members are the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric administration. The industry members are also part of this, and foreign countries. So if a country wants to import shellfish into this country, like New Zealand is a partner country, they have to have an equivalence to our program. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as ours, but the FDA has to evaluate it and determine that it's equivalent and that their shellfish is also as safe as ours is. So the model ordinance basically establishes all the minimum requirements necessary to regulate the interstate commerce of bivalve shellfish, and it establishes a program to protect the public health, the health of consumers by assuring the sale and distribution. So in the end, shellfish that are for sale in a market or whatnot should be safe to eat. So, everybody knows that there are all sorts of other things that go on, like, people who poach closed areas or, other unsavory illegal activities that happen, and that's the enforcement arm. DMR has an enforcement branch, and that's their job to keep people from doing that. But if everybody's following the process here, it should be safe to eat. So the model ordinance includes the growing area classification component, which means that we take all the shellfish harvest areas and we classify it to, I'll go through what the different classifications are, but we determine whether shellfish can be harvested and go direct to market or not. It establishes water quality standards, so we don't get to determine, well, in Maine we think that 52 is a good number to go by. It's, if depending on the method that you're using for testing your fecal coliforms, they establish the limits. It also establishes biotoxin limits, so if you exceed those, you have to close areas. If you find that you've had product that exceeded those limits in the market, you have to do things like recalls, get the product back. It also establishes safe handling and traceback capabilities. So it's also, I think probably now there are more food industries that are going in this direction, but I think it was one of the first industries that had a traceback process that was pretty rigorous. This is just an example of a tag. And when shellfish get harvested, harvesters have to tag the bag of shellfish that they harvest, and then when it goes to the dealer tags it, and so you follow this through the whole process until it gets to a restaurant, and even the restaurant has to hold the tags, so that if there's ever an illness, you, in theory, can trace back through this tag process where those shellfish came from and determine whether it was a problem with the growing area or not. So now I'm going to focus on the growing area program. So there are two components to the water quality program. It's the growing area program, it's the water quality component and the biotoxin component. So this is just a little cartoon I found online and forgot to get the citation. But it gives a good little, like I said, a cartoon of sort of the things that we look at, when we're thinking about how are we going to classify shellfish areas and what do we have to consider. It takes into, what we have to take into account is meteorological issues like precipitation, wastewater treatment plants, big sources of pollution, agriculture. A lot in Maine, there's a ton of private septic systems that we have to consider. Residential runoff, or any runoff really. Also recreational use. So in Maine, there's a lot of water quality declines in Maine because in the summertime, because use of the coast goes up so high. And urban runoff and things like that. We don't have a lot of issues with industrial pollution in Maine. There are some, little spots that I had never heard of until I got into this job, little Superfund sites and things like that you don't know of until you are faced with them. But it's not widespread, not like other states. So the water quality component, the backbone of this component is conducting shoreline survey work. So every 12 years, we have to walk the shoreline of the growing areas that we manage, and we have 45 growing areas. So we look at every property, and we go in and we take a GPS coordinate on any potential pollution sources, so that includes everybody's septic system. If they have a farm, it's the manure pile at the farm. It's pretty intensive, and it's very laborious, but really, the reason it's the backbone of the program is because if you're identifying what actual pollution sources are out there, then your water quality should be confirming what you saw or didn't see on land. So after we do the survey, then we continuously collect water samples. There's over 1,000 stations coastwide, and the ones that are just sort of regular monitoring stations are sampled 6 times a year. That's the model ordinance minimum. But if we're doing special studies on trying to figure out what a pollution source is or what's going on in a certain area, we might do accelerated sampling like every 2 weeks to build the data set. You can't do it, if you're going to use the data for classification, you can't do it any more often than every 2 weeks. We couldn't just build a data set of 30 samples in, a few weeks. That wouldn't be really representative of what's going on. And then we also target a lot of special conditions like rainfall or high flow events for rivers and things like that. So even though we have 1,000 some odd monitoring stations, there's a lot more sampling that goes on. I think last year we had over 13,000 samples that we processed between both of our labs. So we evaluate the water quality data and then classify growing areas. So focusing on the shoreline survey, it's all properties within 500 feet of shore that are inspected, and we're looking at residential, industrial, agricultural. It's all reported in a big sanitary survey report. And then we refer, so one of the things that we've worked on in the last couple of years is that DMR actually has no authority to fix any of these problems. So actually we don't have authority to be on people's property. So we go and ask for permission. We say, can we come on your property and can we look to see if there are any issues or where your septic is? And then if we find a problem, we have to refer it to somebody else. So we've sort of developed a process where we write out problem forms now when we find a problem and then leave them with the town office on our way out of town. And then the town has to deal with it. They have licensed plumbing inspectors, and those people are overseen by the Department of Health and Human Services. So we've sort of closed this loop with these problem forms that if the town doesn't get it back to the Department of Health and Human Services in 30 days, then we let the DHHS know, and then they go after the town. So they have said in the last year or so since we've implemented this that they have never had such good compliance with fixing problems, which is great because then once the problem's fixed, we can reopen shellfish areas. So it's important to people and access. Agricultural problems are referred to the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, which it's now known as, and upstream or industrial problems are referred to DEP. So we don't go any farther than sort of the head of tide or wherever the resource stops, and DEP continues from there because you might have a river draining a big area and bringing all sorts of pollution downstream, but we don't go up that river to try and figure out what's going on. We refer that to DEP. We also do hotspot surveys whenever water quality is declining. So if there's an important harvest area and all of a sudden the water quality starts to go down, we get DEP involved and we go out as a team and start looking around the shoreline to see what changed or why something is sort of going amiss here. I should have said this at the beginning, but if you guys have questions, I like to take questions as we're going, if you have one, so just feel free to interrupt. I also might get caught up in I talk shellfish all the time, every day, so if there are words that I'm throwing out there that don't make any sense, let me know. So this is a map of the growing areas for Western Maine. Like I said, we have 45 statewide, and I believe when these were originally developed, they're sort of supposed to capture watersheds, and that's why they're kind of irregularly shaped. And I'm going to focus, just as a way to illustrate sort of our program, I'm going to focus on our growing area WM, which is the Kennebec River. So the towns that are impacted in the WM growing area are Rouseck, Phippsburg, and Georgetown. And this is a pretty significant resource area and also sort of complicated from a management perspective. This is just a picture of the shoreline segments, so when you go in to do a classification, this is where you start, and we've started doing our shoreline work in 2-mile segments. So every segment has a number. You can see these little identifiers right here, and so people go out and they complete these 2-mile segments, and all of these little points right here are potential pollution sources. So they're probably people's septic systems. And this is something that we have to show the FDA that we have. I think back a number of years ago, they got a lot of hand-drawn maps and it was very labor-intensive. Staff would go out with tax books that they got from the towns. Fortunately, a lot of this is online now, and we also have access to GIS layers and can develop layers. So we can go out with GPS coordinates and cover a lot of area in a day, which is nice. This is a map of the 2011 survey that we did of the Kennebec River. The green area is all the area of the shoreline that we did survey, and the pink or reddish area is areas that didn't get surveyed. The reason for that is either they were prohibited areas or they're islands that don't have any people on them or something like that. So you don't have to do, if you have a big prohibited area and you know what the problem is and you're not going to reopen it, you don't have to keep going in and doing the shoreline survey. This area, you'll see a close-up of this area right here in a minute. This is a little prohibited sliver because there's like 20 overboard discharge units right there, and they're not going anywhere, so it's a waste of our time to go in there and do the shoreline survey.
Kohl might tell them what an overboard discharge is.
Overboard discharge is a kind of like a private wastewater treatment plant. There are houses, so back in the day, before 1976 and the Clean Water Act, people used to just have straight pipes out of their house. And the Clean Water Act came into play, and people started having to have septic systems, treating their waste appropriately. Sometimes there are locations and houses, and because of the configuration of their lot, they can't put in a septic system. It's just not possible. And so they were required to put in overboard discharge systems, which is basically, it is like a little treatment unit. They have a lot of times sand filtration and chlorination. They work, the effluent that comes out of them should be pretty clean. But the problem is because they're little private units, only operating for a single household, we have no idea if they malfunction or not. And there's no, DEP does license and maintain them, but the licensing cycle is like 8 years or something. So they could be malfunctioning for 7.5 years and nobody would ever know. So as part of the model ordinance, the same as wastewater treatment plants, big community wastewater treatment plants, we have to have prohibited areas around overboard discharges. And the water quality might be pristine, but because of that unknown, you still have to keep it closed. There's a lot of overboard discharges in Maine. Still. This is just a map of pollution sources, so you can sort of see what kind of information that we consider and how we sort of display it. This is the upper part of the Kennebec River, and all of these little red stars, these are overboard discharges. These little green lightning flashes are wastewater treatment plant outfalls. This is the star is the actual physical location of a plant, and then the lightning bolt is the outfall. There are a lot more outfalls than you'd expect, and a lot of those they're combined sewer overflow systems, so that when we have wet weather, we still have a lot of plants that have a mechanism for collecting. They continue to collect all the stormwater and mix it with the sewage in one big collection system, and when we get a ton of runoff or rain or something like that, it just overwhelms the system and just bursts out one of these combined sewer overflows. So essentially you've got mixed stormwater and sewage coming out of these areas, which is undesirable. And you'll notice that this is all prohibited, of course. If you get into the lower Kennebec, this is the map to the right. It skips a lot of the middle of the Kennebec, but the map to the right is the lower Kennebec River, and all this green hatching means that it's conditionally approved. It means that we're able to predict at what conditions the water quality degrades in the Kennebec River, and we're closing on those conditions. This is the area I pointed out a minute ago with like the 20 OBDs. So that will, unless those OBDs are removed, that area will never be opened. But you can see anyway the different classifications, and then the yellow dots, well, I think I have another picture of the water quality stations. These yellow dots here are our water quality sampling stations. Those aren't set any, they're not every mile or any kind of fixed setting. They're either to monitor pollution sources, like maybe a stream or something like that that's coming into a cove. We'll place them specifically, or they might be just generally to monitor a big cove or a big resource area. This Atkins Bay is a really big resource area for the folks in Phippsburg, and a really important area for them to be able to harvest. So you'll notice that there's several water quality stations around that bay, so that we can, hopefully get ahead of any potential problems if they start to arise. So the water sampling, what we actually do is we test for fecal coliform. It's an indicator. Another comment. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question about that last map.
Yeah.
So where that cluster of overboard discharge units is, and there's that A3 zone which is prohibited.
Yeah.
So how is the distance between the units themselves and the edge of that triangular shaped boundary?
So you take into account a couple of things. One is what's the output of this system if it's failing. So if it's a 300 gallon a day unit or something, we take that 300 gallons times what the fecal load of untreated sewage would be, and then we do a dilution calculation basically into that area right there at the depth of water that is, how many acres or whatever would it take to dilute that to a level that's not a problem for human consumption or in the shellfish. And then you also have to take into account enforceable lines. So when Marine Patrol is out there, they have to be able to clearly define, where the closure line goes to. So, probably this area doesn't have to go way out to this island, but it does because that's just very easy to enforce. And yep.
Is that maybe it's too much detail, but is that calculation steady state? Is that just volume of water? It's not, doesn't factor in tides or?
Right, it's mean low water. We take in the depth of mean low water, and it's very, very basic. Yeah, it's like steady state. It's not, to do the overboard discharge calculations, we don't do any kind of modeling or anything like that. We do modeling, or other people do modeling for us for around wastewater treatment plants, because that's a lot more complicated, and you also wind up closing much larger areas. But OBDs, it's just pretty straightforward, easy calculation. Okay, so we're testing for fecal coliforms, and yes, fecal coliforms themselves don't make people sick, but it's an indicator that there's feces in the water, basically, and there are other things in fecal material that can make you sick, so that's why we use that. It's also quick and easy. The test that we use is a membrane filtration on an MTEC auger, and it takes 24 hours to incubate and read out. So it's good that it's that quick, because then when we have closures like a flood closure or something like that, we can turn around and get results fairly quickly without waiting 4 or 5 days and costing people opportunities for harvesting at low tide. So we have 2 microbiology labs, one in Boothbay Harbor and one in Lemoyne, and the results from the water quality obviously are used to classify areas, and we do special sampling to identify specific pollution sources or adversities. Like if we think that rainfall has an impact on an area, we might target 1-inch rainstorms or 1 inch and above rainstorms, so that we can see what is the water quality doing when it rains that much. So here's a map of the water quality stations for the whole Kennebec. Again, you can see that, up here where it's all prohibited, we don't have many stations. It's closed because of wastewater treatment plants, so we don't spend a lot of time or energy out there. You also have to keep in mind we have 3,500 some odd miles of coastline. We're doing this for all of those miles. So where you can, sort of cut off a piece that's not important resource-wise, then we certainly do. We have about, give or take, about 30 people in our bureau, so it is quite a few people for this kind of project and effort, but we get spread pretty thin pretty fast. So that just shows you the water quality stations, all those yellow dots, and obviously you see that down here where we have the conditionally approved areas, we have a lot of water quality stations, so that we're monitoring those areas that are open for harvesting. This is just an example of what our water quality data sheets look like. This was one that was actually taken just a couple of days ago by a volunteer. We have volunteers in different areas, especially volunteers who help us with special sampling. This is an adversity sampling for the Kennebec River, because the flow was above 30,000 cubic feet per second, which is our trigger for closure. We had this guy go out and sample the next day to see if the water quality was dirty, because we are still trying to just verify our management plan. So, and this is actually, it was kind of interesting to get this in, because we've been arguing with the folks in Phippsburg. They keep complaining that our trigger level is way too low in the fall, and these scores are pretty crummy. 200, 340, 280, those are not good water quality scores, and this just went slightly over 30,000. So in the fall, the Kennebec River is dirty at 30,000 cubic feet per second. So it's good verification, yeah?
What is a good water quality score?
For the shellfish sanitation program, our limit is 31 if we're using the membrane filtration method. So 31 colony forming units per 100 milliliters of water.
Is that coliforms or E. coli specifically?
Fecal coliform, yeah.
Do you confirm for E. coli?
No. The only time we do E. coli is We don't, actually, because even when we do process waters for dealers, we do sampling in dealer, shellfish dealers, for the water that they're cleaning their shellfish with and things like that. That's a total coliform test, so we don't do any E. coli testing. Right, Paul?
Well, the group might benefit if you could just name what each of those columns are that you're collecting in the field.
Sure. So this is just an indicator if you miss the station, because sometimes when you're sampling during the year, there might be too much ice, you can't get a water sample, or if it's an area that really flats out, there might not be enough water there to sample. So you might miss a station. This is the area, the growing area designation, so this is area WM. This is the station number, so each station has a unique number and is geolocated. So I'm going to help, provide some data to some of the researchers here, and it's all geolocated, so you can do analysis that way. Just the next field is time, what time you collected it, because we have, you only have 24 hours to get these back to the lab and set up. Otherwise you're starting to run into issues where it's not a representative sample of the water quality at the time. This just indicates what method you use to collect, by boat or by land, because we have runs that do both. Sometimes we're collecting from the shore and sometimes we're collecting from boats. Historically, there's been a big argument between the management and the harvesters saying that you should only do it by boat only because it gives you cleaner water quality. And we've done some comparisons, and I don't think that that's really verified, as long as you're not dipping a bag in like a little puddle left on a flat that's completely empty of water. The temperature, this next one is temperature at the sampling station. So we do have temperature associated with all of our samples. The next one is what our sampling strategy was, whether it was a random sample. We have to do, like I said, 6 samples per station randomly every year. It's an A because we were looking at an adversity. We had gone over the flow trigger limit. The condition or adversity is flow, and the open or closed, whether the area was open or closed at the time it was closed. The wind direction, north wind, salinity, and this is really helpful because you can also see when you've got stations really close to streams and you think that that's where the contamination is coming from. After you have runoff, the salinities will drop down and you'll see crummy water quality. So that can help you verify what's going on. What method you use, membrane filtration. So all this part is filled out up to here by the sampler. The salinity is actually done in the lab because it's more consistent. And this is also done in the lab, the actual reading of the score and filled out on the sheet. And then the sampler might make comments like this says 30 plus geese. So if you have a lot of geese in a cove pooping, it can cause problems with water quality. This said 15 eider ducks, so those things are important. And then this whole bottom part of the form, we have to have a pretty rigid on how we handle the samples, our chain of custody, where they're delivered to, who picks them up, how they get to the lab. It also verifies that they get there in the time frame allowed. If any of those things are not met, if we go over our time limit or whatever, we have to toss the samples. So it's a pretty prescriptive program. Yep.
This is fantastic. So one of the questions that occurs to me with regards to the 24-hour development time for the samples is, say you have, you do a test and you need to close, then are there not already shellfish in the product stream that are headed out? And then,
so all of our classifications are made using a set of data. We can't use any fewer than 30 data points to make a classification. So until you get those 30 data points, if you're originally classifying an area for the first time, it has to stay closed. Once you get those 30 data points, you can make the determination on what classification it should be. And then basically, unless you have a reason to change the classification because the routine sampling, the water quality is declining over time or something like that, then it stays in that classification. The important part is this is a risk assessment program. There are times when water quality, when there's going to be geese in a cove that aren't there when we're sampling all the time, and the water quality might be bad. But there's so much, there's so many layers of conservative interpretation for the different limits that, that's sort of accounted for, but it is not perfect. It's not a perfect system by any stretch.
I suppose the easier question that would help me understand then is how often does does a new closure occur in a given area?
We evaluate every area and every station annually. So every year, we take the most recent 30 data points. So that's a sliding scale.
Yeah.
But every year, you take the most recent 30 data points and you evaluate it for its P90 score and its geomean, and to see if you meet the classification standards for what it is. If you're out doing shoreline survey work and you find a pollution source like a blown up septic, you close right away. If you find in your analysis of your water quality data for that year at the end of the year that it doesn't meet the standard anymore, we reclassify. So it's done every year.
And so how much turnover do you think?
I think the flip-flopping determines on how conservative of a program you're running and how well you did zeroing in on the adversities of that area. You know, people get off on tangents, you know. We've really centralized decision-making now to a couple of people who really understand hydrographics, meteorological inputs, you know, all the things that we need to be considering so that things are hopefully more consistent. But I think that, you know, the more people you have making those decisions, the more variable it's going to be. Some people are going to be extremely conservative, you know, well, at, you know, one low tide, the scores were terrible, so I don't think we can open this, to people who are like, oh yeah, this looks great. So I think the consistency of the program comes down to who's making the decisions, and that's always going to change, you know. Right
Yeah.
now it's me and my team, but, you know, it used to be Paul. Yeah.
Cool, when you, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
There was a lot of data in there in terms of like just salinities and temperatures for all over the state. Is any of that publicly available?
Yeah, you guys can request
time,
whatever you want.
histories?
You know, if you have areas that you're interested in, we basically sample the whole coast.
Right.
So if you have areas that you're interested in, you can put in a request and we can do a query and pull it out, you know, whatever you're interested in. It's all public data. It's massive, so we have at least back to the early 90s in an Oracle database that we use currently. So, you know, like just giving somebody the whole thing is probably unwieldy and not helpful to you, but if you can zero in on requests, we can definitely get you information. Chris, did you have a question?
Yeah, when you when I fix a septic problem, isn't there some minimum number of samples you need before you reopen right away, or is there nothing fixed there? So
Well,
say there was a, you know, we closed it, it got blew out, we fixed it, and I thought there was some number of samples that you typically took before you reopened.
It depends.
Okay.
Sometimes you'll find a blown up septic, but the water quality will have never declined. For some reason, it wasn't really making it into the cove, and you could just say, verify that the septic was fixed and just reopen right away.
Okay.
If the water quality had declined for some period of time, you think it's the septic you found, but you have to make sure. So you want some span of data points that say, yes, water quality is definitely improving, and it must have been that septic.
And that's just a judgment call.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I don't think there's any formula to when you
Okay.
reopen. As long as we can, you know, show, basically we get evaluated by the FDA, and as long as we can show them exactly why we made this decision and it makes sense, then, you know, it can fly. Yeah.
Paul, you mentioned one class as conditionally approved.
Yep.
So, and if I heard you right, it was you guys through years of data collection and your surveys have a sense of under what conditions that can be open.
Yep.
So is it a case like the high flow event or some of these other
Yep.
triggers that
I have a slide with all the different classifications, so when I get there, maybe we can touch on that again. Okay, so this is what the water quality sample data looks like once you've done your calculations. This is, like I said, membrane filtration with MTech auger. Different states use different things. There's actually only two things you can use. You can either use membrane filtration with MTech, or you can use most MPNs, most probable numbers, which is a bunch of test tubes. The standard that we use is 31. You can see here. I'll walk you through the table. This is the station again, the number, the classification conditionally approved. This is the count of samples, so we're pulling the most recent 30 samples. We transitioned from MPN to membrane filtration a number of years ago, so we had a sliding scale of the approved limit for a while because the approved limit for membrane filtration is lower than MPN. So if we didn't have 30 full samples of the membrane filtration, it would show us there. This is the geomean, standard deviation, the maximum sample number. So one time we had a 140 was the max in the last 30 samples for that particular station. This is all that Atkins Bay area. I don't know if you remember from the map. This is your P90 calculation. So this is where you have to have the approved standard of 31 to be approved. To go, basically what approved means is you harvest it and it goes direct to market without any kind of processing or anything. And the restricted standard, if you had restricted here, it's 163. And then when the minimum sample date is. So what that means is to get those 30 samples, you're going back to 2008 for this station. To get these 30 samples, you're going back to 2009. And the reason those will vary is sometimes some stations are put into accelerated sampling, some others aren't. You know, that will slide up and down. So these are our standards in the model ordinance for our classification for approved. So when we do the growing area classification process, we're considering all of these things. We've done our shoreline survey, we've got our water quality data, we've considered meteorological issues, hydrographic issues, big point source pollution like municipal wastewater treatment plants. If you have an industrial pollution source, you know, we used to have a lot of those, like paper mills and things like that. Those are all too far upriver now for us to really worry about, but down in the Portland area, you've got different industrial things going on. Marinas, those are they're a pollution source in the summertime because, you know, people aren't supposed to open their stopcock valve or whatever it's called, but they do. Stormwater, streams, agricultural activities, domestic animals, when people are walking their dogs on the beach. I never have looked at people and their dogs on the beach in the same way since I started this job. Wildlife activity, which I also mentioned, and recreational use. You know, around campgrounds in the summertime, we see issues with water quality, so we have to close areas. Like I said, in the summer in Maine, there's a lot of seasonal closures just because of, you know, things like this, beach use. So these are the classifications that we can pick from. This is defined by the model ordinance. So we can have approved, which means that a harvester goes into a flat and digs the flat and he takes it right to market. It doesn't have to do anything else with it. There's conditionally approved, which means that we have determined as the authority that there are predictable conditions that we can control for, so that when those conditions aren't going on, the shellfish can go direct to market. When those conditions are going on, we have it closed. So some of those predictable conditions can include things like, you know, a rainfall trigger, river flow like in the Kennebec, on marinas because they're seasonal. You know, in Maine, people don't have year-round marinas. So, you know, if by November 1st that marina is closed and all the boats are hauled out, you can open that area then. And also seasonal use. Restricted means that the product must be depurated. So that can take two forms. Either you can have a processing plant, that we have one in Maine, Spinning Creek Shellfish down in Elliott, where they actually purify the shellfish by running clean water through them for 44 hours. Or you can do it through a relay activity. You can take shellfish from a restricted area, put them, like say, aquaculturists do this, not infrequently. They'll have a lease site in the restricted area. They'll take them from that restricted area, put them on a lease site in an approved area, allow them to purge for 14 days, we test them, and they can send them to market. Conditionally restricted means the same thing as conditionally approved, except the water quality is poorer, so if you do harvest from that area, they have to be depurated. And prohibited means you can't take anything out of a prohibited area unless it's seed for maybe an aquaculture site or people who are reseeding clam flats. You can do things like depletion and also shellfish for bait. Some other states get involved in that. We have done that in the past, but not in quite a while as far as I know. Did that answer your question about classifications?
Yes, thank you very much.
What'd you say?
Sorry, what's depletion?
If you have a prohibited area and there's a ton of clams in there, the theory, I think, is that it's very attractive for poaching. And so some states will go in and thin it out, basically, so it's less attractive, and maybe put it in an area. I think Rhode Island takes it and puts it into, like, spawning reserves, so that they have areas for spawning and things like that. So this is what our legal notice map looks like. So in the end, this is what we come out with for the Kennebec River. This little box up in this corner describes the different conditions, and based on data analysis from October 1st to January 31st, water quality declines at 30,000 CFS. In February to April, it's up to 60,000, and that's probably, the water quality data bears this out, but it's probably because it's a lot of snow melt or snowfall, things like that, that don't tend to have the fecal coliforms, and they're also not persisting in the environment if they're there. And then May to September 30th, river discharge exceeds 40,000 is when we close it. So it's a little bit higher in the summer, but not a lot. So the Kennebec conditional areas, just to zero in on this a little bit more as an example, the way we've been classifying this river is using flow basically as sort of a catch-all. Flow increases when there's a lot of rain or snow or some kind of precipitation. There's runoff from the land, and that's impacting the river, and then the river is, impacting the shellfish flats. So we're closed on the variable flow levels. We look at two gauges, the Androscoggin and the Kennebec River gauges, because they merge into Merrymeeting Bay. If you don't know this, that whole watershed basically drains 1/5 of the state's landmass. So this is a huge input, a huge area that's being drained. And it's certainly not surprising that water quality declines at higher flows of this river. Also, there's, I think, eight or 10 plants, wastewater treatment plants up the individual rivers as far as Waterville on the Kennebec side, and I don't remember what the furthest one north on the Androscoggin is, but that's a lot of inputs. Those are some big communities. Lewiston on the Androscoggin is the highest one. So those are some significant inputs from wastewater treatment plants coming down in these rivers. They're a long way off, so that helps. And also the mouth of the Kennebec, there's a ton of flushing. So that also helps, but there's no surprise that there are water quality issues here. So these are the gauges that we use. You guys probably are aware of this, but this is sort of like a package tool that we can use to monitor shellfish areas. If these weren't here, we couldn't do flow management unless we instituted gauges of our own, and I don't think that's going to happen. So this also means that you can't do it on every river. Even if flow is probably a good indicator for water quality, if there isn't a USGS sponsored gauge, you're kind of dead in the water. So a lot of times equipment limits what we can do. Rain gauges are another big one. If you don't have rain gauges in an area, you can't make determinations on what the impact of rain is. So we've worked with a lot of communities, if they've complained like, well, we're always shut down and it didn't rain that much here. We say, well, sponsor a rain gauge, put it at your town office, we'll use it if you if you are able to put it up. So when we make a closure, the process is, we say, okay, the Kennebec River is over 30,000, we're going to make the closure. We post it on our website. This is just a screenshot of our website. We call into a hotline and leave a message so that people can find out what's closed and what isn't on a hotline, and then we send out emails we have a big industry interest list, which includes, well, it's not just an industry interest list, industry, managers, Marine Patrol, townsfolk, because they have to enforce these closures. All the towns that have shellfish programs have a municipal shellfish warden also. And so they need to know when things happen so that they can enforce the closures along with the state Marine Patrol. So then you close the river. Now you have to get it reopened. So without any kind of contaminant reduction study, so if you don't specifically do some kind of study to determine how fast the shellfish are purging from the abuse or adversity that they experienced, then basically the rule of thumb that's in the model ordinance is within 14 days you can reopen an area and just verify that the water quality has returned to normal. However, if you do a contamination reduction study, which can vary on a ton of things, especially things like temperature and salinity and whatnot, you can open sooner. So in 2012, we undertook a massive sampling effort in the Kennebec to compare the water quality with the shellfish meats. And I say massive, it's a lot of logistic effort to get samples of both water, which is at high tide, and shellfish meats, which is at low tide, at multiple stations in 3 different towns, get it to the lab. The lab is a bottleneck because they have to be prepared and ready to get these samples done with all the right media prepared and et cetera, et cetera. It's lots of weekend work, it's lots of holiday work. This always, I worked on Thanksgiving, it always happens. That's how Paul lost his hair. But anyway, bringing these studies together is, a real exercise in logistics. And so, you know, if you actually look at the data, it might not seem massive, but it was a big undertaking. So anyway, so we did this comparison, and when we looked at the data, the relationship is not, it's just not real tight between shellfish meats and water quality. I mean, the first time we did this, I was kind of thinking, geez, what is this whole program? What's the premise? Because all sorts of things impact it. You know, if the shellfish aren't pumping because the water's cold, they're not going to uptake any of the bacteria. But if they are pumping, or maybe they pumped and then they're in pre-spawning accumulation process and they're not pumping after that because they're, you know, in spawning mode, all of this stuff kind of confounds the data. It's very messy, but all in all, we determined that basically in 8 days, because of the flushing rates of the Kennebec, that the water was back to normal and the shellfish were likely purged from the insult. And so now we have, in 2013, we implemented an 8-day reopening, automatic reopening, so that after the river flow reduces below the 30,000. So if you have a ton of rain and it goes above 30,000 and keeps going up to 40, 60, whatever, we have to wait till it comes back down below 30, and then you have 8 days from there that you can reopen. So that's all the water quality stuff, yeah.
So a real quick question. You did the Kennebec study. Were there 10 other rivers asking for 8 days?
Hang on 1 second.
Yeah. That's all been nice. Tell him I said hi.
That's my husband. Okay, what did you say?
So the Kennebec got 14 days down to 8 days
Yes.
after you did a massive study.
Yep.
Were there 10 other rivers? Did the St. George people call you the next day and ask? how can
No,
we get
you know, surprisingly, we haven't had a lot of why them and not us. The Phippsburg, the town of Phippsburg, invested a lot in that study.
Okay.
They actually were paying the volunteer. He was a volunteer for us, but they were actually compensating him to be able to do this. So that was part of why that worked. We did do it on the Madomic as well, and we did all of the sampling with shellfish harvester volunteers. And basically where we are with this is if the systems are relatively similar, you know, like if they are about the same size and the same geographic makeup, sort of, that we're taking one study in one place and interpreting into another area. We use the Madomic study also in the St. George without repeating the whole study because they seem similar enough.
Yeah.
Whether that's, you know, legitimate or not, we'd have to do a whole nother study in the St. George, but I think we can make the argument that they're similar enough. They're close geographically, et cetera, et cetera. Other areas like the Scarborough River, you know, well, why can't you just implement that study in the Scarborough River? Because they have conditional rainfall areas also. Well, that's a humongous marsh. You know, it's a very different kind of system, and I think that we probably would have to confirm that those levels or those purging rates are the same and the system operates the same. So I think it, you know, it's interpretive again, but I think you have to sort of look at, the Kennebec is a huge river. That's very different than the Madomic. You know, we couldn't have just sort of used one for the other, I don't think.
So the criteria is based on a peak flow rate, 30,000. There are a lot of things that go on a hydrograph over a storm. Has anybody looked at the using volume as total volume of flow as a metric rather than the peak?
Nope.
I'm just wondering because also snowmelt has a big effect on the peak relative to the volume, and the architecture of the hydrograph look very different.
No, I mean, we haven't, and it doesn't mean that probably, you know, that could be a better tool. I think one of the things that happens in this program is that you get a lot of people, you wind up trying to evaluate data in a lot of different ways, trying to figure out what the real insults are, and you might not have the expertise for actually determining what those are. You know, you can't think about something that you just don't even know about. You know, like if you're not aware of that, you're not going to think of it, and so you're looking just at flow. So we're limited in our own capacity, you know, for just understanding how these things influence water quality. So, you know, that's why I'm excited about, you know, working with people at the university to bring in those expertise and, you know, talk about how, well, geez, this might be a better way to look at why water quality is declining in this area. We definitely, you know, I don't feel confident that we have the right triggers picked every time. Yeah.
What about the other hot spots that you talked about? How are those chosen for surveys?
So if we do those based on resource, if it's an important resource area and water quality has declined, you know, it used to be really pristine and all of a sudden it's starting to get bad, then we know it's an important area for harvesters. So we try and go in and do a hotspot survey to see if we can find out why has this changed, you know, what has changed in this environment that's causing the water quality decline, so that we can try and keep it open. You know, otherwise you just wind up waiting until it goes over that limit and then you close it and people lose this big harvest area, and then you're trying to make up data, figure out what the problem was, make up data and get it back on track. You
So
lose
the
a lot of
priority
time.
sites are the ones that are approved or conditionally approved in your scene and trying to go in
Right.
south.
Right.
How do you, once you, is it like you're adding data to the yearly sanitary surveys or the 12-year sanitary surveys?
Yeah, you're always adding 30 samples is what you're looking at, and so
Yeah.
every year you're adding 6 to whatever new 6 samples.
Yeah, the potential pollution sites that you actually find when you do the hotspot survey, then you add that to the sites that you already know about?
Well, if
or-
you're investigating a pollution problem, they would be outside of the regular monitoring water quality data. You would be maybe taking a sample from a stream because you think the stream is hot and might be what's causing the problem, but that would be outside of the classification because you're taking a sample in an area that you normally wouldn't, and it's not a monitoring station.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
And
those
how
are-
do you ever bring those data points together to look at the larger picture of what might be going on?
Right. Yes, we do,
Okay.
because we're looking at those specific targeted sample sites that we're adding in all the time, seeing if these are the problem, and if they come back hot, you know, we're saying, okay, this is our problem, now let's sample more here because maybe we could do a dilution calculation around this stream and just close the upper part of the cove or something like that. And you always have to add in sample stations to sort of verify your lines. You know, every time you're drawing a new line, you have to be able to validate that line, so you need to have new stations there. So you're constantly adding and taking stations away. So, did anybody have any other water quality questions, or we're kind of out of time? So I had a little bit about biotoxin, but I don't know that that's really the interest of this group anymore.
Well, we are probably out of time, and this isn't what we decided to focus on this particular grant. So, I mean, maybe one way to do it is for people that would love to talk to you more about that to come up at the end. There's plenty of time for people who can hang around, but I guess there might be some more Q&A about what you've covered so far. So, is that all right?
That's fine with me,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So let me just, before people have to run, thanks for a great talk, and let's get into it.
You mentioned potential capacity needs related to the monitoring and the biophysical science. And I wondered, given all these different groups and agencies that you're working with and individuals, do you see different capacity needs for coordination and collaboration, communication, other things that NEST might be able to do to understand some of that and feed into it?
We, you know, as far as like interagency kind of communications, you know, one of the things that I think was really lacking when we came in was DMR wasn't talking a lot to DEP, and they weren't talking a lot to Department of Agriculture, and we tried to tighten a lot of that up already. And like I said, those problem forms, so you sort of have this communication loop. I don't know of any areas that right now we need a lot of help with that, because where the sticking point is now is just people doing what they're supposed to do, and they know what they're supposed to do. You know, so that comes down to talking with, you know, bosses and stuff. Yeah.
Well, just to connect with this in a conversation, some of us had the good fortune to have lunch with Kohl earlier. When you were mentioning the contamination reduction studies, and I'm interested more about Phippsburg and how they paid for volunteers to do some work, it struck me that you could imagine a citizen science piece of NEST potentially being helpful to kind of mobilize, and you talked a little bit about how you guys use citizen science and what some of the challenges are. But is that another piece of this? In other words, if there's a place where those contamination reduction studies are needed, but there's nowhere near the kind of person power, what about that?
Anywhere where we've implemented those studies in the Madomic and in the Kennebec, we have had to use volunteers, especially because you're working at two separate tides. So for the shellfish collection, harvesters can do it in like 2 seconds. And we wind up digging and, oh crap, we broke another one. Because you have to have pristine, they can't be broken at all, the shellfish. So a lot of times it's way more efficient and effective for us to team up with harvesters, especially for shellfish sampling. So we have done a lot of that. And I think that there is room for, where we've got a specific project that we want to work on, there is definitely room to get committed volunteers. I think the stopping point for a lot of people is it's not predictable. Our random runs are already pre-scheduled and those are easy. It's whenever you're looking at adversities, like who knows when it's going to rain. I mean, a couple of days in advance it's probably going to rain, but you don't know exactly how much. And so it's always a last minute, like calling out the volunteers, and that works well sometimes and it totally falls apart other times. In the Madomic, we've worked with the Land Trust over the last year, and they've been great. They have one person who coordinates a team of people who takes, like 30 or 40 samples in the village. So it can definitely work.
Hey Cole, we've taken on our NEST project here a focus on pathogens.
Yep.
Of the restricted areas, maybe the conditional ones too. What percentage do you think are due to other things besides pathogens? Like industrial pollutants or dioxins, anything like that, or is that not part of what you've been looking at?
Well, I think historically those things are all considered, but like I said, there's very poor guidance on how to handle those deleterious substances.
Yep.
FDA doesn't currently have a recommendation for mercury levels in shellfish. They have an action level that if it's at 1 ppm, I think, you have to pull it off the shelf. But beside that, there isn't a lot of guidance on how you handle things like heavy metal contamination. So it's sort of a best judgment, I think, and some areas are closed that have been closed for, probably 20 years because an old mine was there, and tailings or whatever have gone into the coastal area. But it's not consistent on how we handle those things.
Keep your hair cold.
Thanks, Paul.
So if anybody else has questions, feel free to come on up. And thanks again for a wonderful
No
talk.
problem.